Welcome back to The Explainer. Look, today we are unpacking an incredibly dense and honestly highly provocative geopolitical analysis from a recent interview with Professor Jiang. We're going to break down some really startling claims about the current state of global affairs. Now, I want to be super clear right out of the gate. We are taking a strictly neutral look at this material. We're not here to endorse these viewpoints, but we are absolutely going to unpack the whole shebang so you can clearly understand this really complex framework he's presenting. Okay, let's dive into this because the core premise of the professor's analysis starts with a pretty jarring question. Has World War III already begun? Well, his answer is a resounding yes. The claim here is that global conflict isn't just some dark cloud on the horizon. It is an active, ongoing reality right now. It's just being fought through economics, proxy battles, and strategic maneuvering rather than your traditional boots-on-the-ground battlefield combat. So why make such a massive claim? To understand that, we kind of have to look at the foundation of his argument. The professor builds this whole analytical framework on three very specific predictions he made for the year 2024 regarding the US and Iran. According to the interview, these predictions, that Donald Trump would win the election, that the US would enter an active war with Iran, and that the US would ultimately lose that war, have already begun to perfectly unfold. And in doing so, they're actively reshaping the entire geopolitical map. Here is our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with a global game board, zoom in on the Iranian flashpoint, check out some future predictions, explore the architecture of control, and finally look at collapse in community. Section 1. The global game board. The players and their strategies. And this brilliantly illustrates the foundational lens of this entire analysis. Game theory. To map out these global strategies, the framework uses this fascinating chessboard analogy. It basically assumes that the world operates on strict rules and incentives. If you can just understand the fundamental self-interest of a nation-state, you can accurately predict their next move on the board. They aren't just acting randomly, right? They're acting to survive and conquer. Let's walk through this game board. We've got four major powers here. The US, operating as a democracy, uses a Fortress America strategy. They leverage their tech, the mighty US dollar, and media to maintain global hegemony. Then you have Russia, an autocracy, pursuing a Third Rome strategy, basically seeking to restore its historical and religious imperial glory. They rely heavily on their massive geography and dominant land artillery. Next up, Israel, a mixed democracy and theocracy, operates with the goal of a greater Israel, utilizing incredible intelligence networks like Mossad. And finally, Iran, a theocracy, aiming to unite the Muslim world by using proxy militias and asymmetrical drone warfare. The framework argues that because these grand strategies completely conflict with one another, a global collision is absolutely inevitable. Moving right along to Section 2, the Iranian flashpoint, topography and strategy. This brings us to the active flashpoint in the Middle East. The analysis argues that the US felt forced to engage with Iran just to protect the petrodollar system from this rising Eurasian alliance between Russia, China, and Iran. But here is where the professor claims a huge miscalculation happened. Contrast the geography for a second. Iraq was a flat desert. It was super vulnerable to standard US military tactics, those rapid shock and awe decapitation strikes that won the war in a matter of weeks. Iran, on the other hand, is a literal mountain fortress. It is practically built for guerrilla warfare and a drawn-out war of attrition. The argument here is simple. You literally can't wipe out leadership that's hidden deep inside mountain bunkers just by dropping bombs from the air. So the crucial point is that because quick decapitation strikes completely fail in Iran, the US has reportedly pivoted to this three-point strangulation strategy. The goal is to entirely blockade Iran economically, set up forward operating bases on its borders to stir up ethnic violence among minority groups, and systematically cut off water, electricity, and food to Tehran. Basically, the strategy is to force the civilian population to get so desperate that they turn on their own government. But Iran is pushing back, using what Professor Jiang calls the mosaic strategy. To counter all that US surveillance and air supremacy, Iran has completely decentralized its military command. They've divided their forces across 31 different provinces, and each one has its own localized leadership. It's a fight-to-the-death structure. Even if you somehow take out the central government, you've still got these 31 independent armies that will just keep grinding out a war of attrition. All right, Section 3, Future Geopolitical Predictions. What the source claims is next. 80 to 90%. That is the probability the professor assigns to this conflict expanding into full-blown World War III. He doesn't see this as a maybe. He views it as a near-certain inevitability, driven entirely by those rigid, conflicting grand strategies we mapped out on the game board earlier. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of these politically charged predictions. It's staggering. And again, we're neutrally reporting the framework here, but wow. The professor predicts that Donald Trump will actually attempt to secure a constitutionally unprecedented third term. He claims the U.S. is going to institute a mandatory national draft to keep feeding these forever wars. On top of that, he forecasts a rapid global shift toward an AI-monitored civilian state linked to digital IDs. And as if that's not enough, he anticipates the conflict expanding, with Russia and NATO directly clashing over the critical port of Odessa, and entirely new conflicts blowing up over Taiwan and the South China Sea. And as if that's not enough, he anticipates the conflict expanding, with Russia and NATO directly clashing over the critical port of Odessa, and entirely new conflicts blowing up over Taiwan and the South China Sea. There's also this highly specific, kind of surprising sub-prediction nestled in here. The analysis suggests that North Korea is going to capitalize on the fact that the US, Russia, and China are entirely distracted. Using the threat of their massive artillery pointed right at Seoul, North Korea will essentially extort South Korea for resources. It's a classic play, making a move while the world's policemen are looking the other way. Section 4. The Architecture of Control, the Modern Allegory of the Cave. Let's move to and see how this builds the actual layers of systemic control that dictate our reality. To explain how populations just accept these massive geopolitical shifts, the framework leans on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. In this modern adaptation, the chains holding the public in place, that's the military-industrial complex. The fire and the puppeteers casting the shadows, that's the private financial elite and bankers controlling the money supply. Then you have multilateral organizations casting the illusion of a fair global economy. And finally, the media and education systems step in to legitimize those shadows, basically convincing the public that the illusion on the wall is undeniable reality. Finally, Section 5. Collapse and Community, the Fall of Empires and the Future. So, this brings us to the final act. If this architecture of control is really that rigid, and the global game board is totally locked in an inevitable conflict, what happens next? Well, the professor compares our current moment to the Bronze Age collapse from over 3,000 years ago. Back then, a perfect storm of earthquakes, famine, and war caused massive civilization-ending migrations. The framework asserts that the American empire could similarly collapse in the next 5 to 10 years, just completely crumbling under the weight of extreme debt, systemic corruption, inequality, and impending mass migrations driven by global instability and lack of resources. It's a heavy comparison for sure. But actually, despite this incredibly dark geopolitical forecast, the interview ends on a surprisingly uplifting note. The overarching takeaway here is that survival isn't about hoarding resources in a bunker. It depends entirely on local resilience, community creativity, and unconditional love. As the macro structures of empire fall apart around us, it's those micro connections with our literal neighbors that will pull humanity through the darkness. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to ponder after all this intense analysis. If the massive global structures of reality we've examined today truly begin to collapse over the next decade, is your local community ready to build a new one together? Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.